Next we're going to talk about some common problems for the tutoring sessions. The first problem I want to bring up is organization. We've talked about global revisions, but students often have little idea of what these are and often have even less of an idea of how to remedy them. And so oftentimes I will draw a funnel of a formal paper, and this is a really basic kind of overview of the intro, body, and conclusion sections to a paper to kind of give the students a visual to go off of. And I use this in my classes at Kent State as well. So in the intro here, you want to start out broad, as the funnel is pretty broad, and you want to maybe bring up the topic that you're going to start with and then narrow down slowly to the thesis. So you're giving the background of the topic and you're narrowing, you're getting more specific and more specific and more specific until you get to finally a thesis. Might be a debatable argument about that topic or a certain viewpoint you're trying to get across. Then all the body paragraphs of this section should refer back to the thesis. So that's why all the sides of this funnel are in line with the thesis, because nothing should be mentioned that doesn't go back to the thesis or doesn't correspond with this thesis. Anything that's related to some things that are in the introduction or the background would be outside of the scope for this essay. So it kind of shows the student what would be in scope and what would be out of scope. And this is to differentiate. You want to be very clear about the 5-paragraph theme, which students may have learned in high school, which consists of the intro, 3 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. And it's very simplistic, and it oftentimes doesn't work for the requirements of college papers based on structure and just length even. And so you want to differentiate to the students, this is not the 5-paragraph theme. In the body, you can have 4 body paragraphs. You can have 10 body paragraphs. You could have 2 body paragraphs. It all depends on the kind of point. Your paragraph should be based on the kind of points you're trying to make and how you're trying to make them, rather than a set structure that has 3 reasons for every thesis, and each reason is discussed in a separate body paragraph. To help the student with body paragraphs, you might notice that the student doesn't have topic sentences or conclusion sentences. So you might want to note on the sheet, in each body paragraph you should have T, B, and C. Topic sentence, body evidence, citations if they're using outside research, or examples if they're not, and a conclusion or a clincher sentence to remind your reader what that thesis is and to connect that body paragraph, what you said, to show how that connects to the thesis. And so these can vary, of course. These are not so rigid as they might seem here on this paper, but oftentimes this gives students something to go off of instead of just like nothing, the blank paper, which is the death of every project. You might even tell students they can address one point in 2 body paragraphs. Say they have a point and then they have another sub-point about that point. You might want to say, just make this a new paragraph. Generally, I don't want paragraphs to go over 3/4 of a page. It's too hard for the reader to stay in double-spaced. It's too hard for the reader to stay focused. So you can remind students of that if they have massive body paragraphs. For the conclusion, the best thing to do is to restate this thesis in different words and then give the significance. Why is this important? Why is this argument valid or necessary or important for the world? And you might, if you gave a problem that you're addressing or you're proving that something is a problem, you might hint at a solution for the conclusion, something that would widen out this argument and put it in its larger context. Conclusions are very hard for most students, but if you give them that, it's going to be a better conclusion than the summary conclusion of what I already said, which nobody wants to read. So you can keep this in mind if this helps any sessions. If it hinders a session, say you have a more advanced or complicated paper, it may need some modification. And you also want to compare this to the rubric for a teacher's requirements for structure, which always trumps this. Okay, say you're helping the student find strengths and weaknesses of the paper, and you see a lot of sentence level errors, the local revisions that we've been talking about. These grammar errors, if you see them in large amounts, you might want to write, subject-verb agreement on a separate sheet of paper, or comma errors, and then that student will be aware of those things to look back for. Those are patterns of error. but you probably want to show the student how to fix a few of those lines. So you may go to the handbook and point out some resources for going back to how to use a comma after an introductory clause, for example. And you might say, this is how, some examples from this. Now, how can you change this sentence? Or where else do you see this error in your paragraphs? Oftentimes, the reader of the paper may be confused by the grammar, but it may be grammatically correct. They may be confused by the word choice or the structure of a sentence. So remind the student that English is about convention and clarity instead of just adhering to grammar rules. Those things are also important, so you want to eliminate awkward wording and things that might be confusing to a potential reader. If you fix a few lines of grammar, ask the student to apply the concept to the next view. If the student understands, then ask the student to fix similar errors on his or her own time. This conserves time in the session and also allows the student to practice them on his or her own. If a student has a hard time identifying errors in sentence structure, a good strategy is to have the student read the sentence out loud. Oftentimes the ear will correct an error and they'll just read it correctly, but then you can show them how what they said it differs from what's on the page. Number 3, say you don't know an answer to a question. I can't tell you how many times this happened to me. And the big thing to remember is it's okay. You're not expected to know every single error for every single answer for every single error. You can look it up with the guidebooks or use online writing lab resources. Purdue OWL is a good one, and University of North Carolina's Writing Center at Chapel Hill. But if you have time for that, if you don't have time for that, you can show the student where he or she could find that answer, or you might table it to the end of your session when you might have more time. You might also ask the student for specific questions to ask the professor, because that's obviously not going to be found in any guidebooks or the professor's preference on a certain usage. For example, the usage of the word you in academic writing may be appropriate for some assignments and not for others. You can also get a student's email if you have time and look it up. If you know like right where it is, you can look it up after they leave and email it to them. But you're not under any obligation to do that. You might have other students. Be familiar ahead of time with the most common grammatical mistakes that a student may encounter so that it saves time during the session when you're looking it up in a book, or you don't even need to look it up in a book if you feel comfortable with it. Fused sentences is a big one, run-ons. Comma splices, which are two complete sentences connected by a comma. The use of apostrophes in possession, either apostrophe S or S apostrophe, or sometimes the student has no apostrophe at all, or apostrophe S where it's not supposed to be there. Subject-verb agreement. Tense consistency should be one tense the entire paper if everything is happening at the same time. And active versus passive voice. Active voice is preferred in professional contexts, but for science writing, passive voice is often preferred. Semicolon use. You must have complete sentences on each side of the semicolon. And format errors, MLA, APA, Chicago, Turabian, etc. Errors in citation, quotation, things like that. Number 4, what happens if the student is stuck and doesn't know where to begin? Oftentimes you'll get students who have written a draft and who just want you to edit the paper or come in with local revision concerns, and then you'll redirect the student towards global revisions as well. But sometimes you will get the student who hasn't even written anything on the paper yet when he or she arrives, and they're often frustrated because they've been thinking about it and they've been looking at a blank screen and nothing has been happening, or they haven't gotten inspired. A lot of students feel as if the muse must move them. But you can show them some strategies where if they get stuck, they don't have to wait for the muse. They can try some of the things like brainstorming, bubbling, free writing, writing the first thing that comes to mind, talking out loud about a topic with the tutor. You can make suggestions, but also ask them to think of some other suggestions in certain categories when you're making charts. Use leading questions. So if you're asking a student about a topic, you may ask, what's most interesting to you about this? That often generates an idea, or at least some ideas to work with, and the student can generate from there. Number 5. The paper is too long to review in one session. There's often times you will get a paper that's 25 pages. How do you do that in 30 minutes? That's impossible. You might tell the student that it would be best to sign up for a second session if nobody has signed up for that second session with you yet, or it might be best to come back to do the second half in another day. But what would really benefit your session, if you only have that 30 minutes, is to prioritize your concerns and make sure you're addressing the global changes that need to be done first before the editing and local sentence revision. Get some scrap paper, and you might table some things to do next time, and we might work on the conclusion last and move that for next time, and then you can work on some things that the student really wants addressed in that session. Fix a few sections and then ask the student to apply the same kind of changes to the rest of the document. Next, the student may be uncomfortable making changes to the paper itself and may expect the tutor to do all of the work. Use active listening when you're questioning the student on the topic and you're using those leading questions. And Ryan and Zimmerelli from the Bedford Guide for Writing Tutors indicate that silence is not a bad thing. And this is hard because I know silence makes me uncomfortable in a session, but I've learned to get beyond that and to try to maybe just allow the student some time to think. If you're saying, what would you do in this situation? Give it some time. The student is not going to respond in that next second and may even expect you to respond. So you may indicate to the student that active participation is necessary. Use that wait time. Next, the paper requires outside research. If research beyond the course text is required, students often don't know how to use the library website or how to get on the databases and kind of even find that research, or what research would be appropriate for online sources. So you might want to spend some time, just 5 minutes in this session, showing the student how to get to that area and finding maybe one article, and don't find the rest of them in that session, but let the student find the rest on his or her own time.